We're continuing with Dr. David Webster and talking about Buddhism. And Dave, for this session I'd like to talk to you about Buddhist thought concerning existence. And I understand there are three key marks that Buddhist thought brings out.
Yeah, absolutely, Lloyd, that's quite right. There are these things known as the 3 marks of existence. Existence is an awkward word in this context.
Okay.
Because it can need some qualification. It perhaps is better rendered as being the 3 marks of conditioned phenomena. That's much more awkward and difficult and problematic, but it's actually more accurate in terms of what Buddhism actually thinks. Because, well, these things, well, not all of them, might apply to nirvana.
Right.
And some of them do and some of them don't, as it happens. So existence in this context doesn't include nirvana. So it's all existence. It's, another way to put it might be the 3 marks of the world as we experience it. So it's existence for us.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah. So it's 3 marks for existence for us, for a being who's looking out from in themselves to the world around us. Might remind some students think about Kant, about the difference between things as they are and things as we experience them. But as we, for all extents and purposes, for most of us, for what Buddhism called mere worldlings, pujanas, people, normal people, the world is characterised, it's sometimes called the 3 characteristic features of existence. The world is characterised by having these 3 features, and they are anicca, impermanence, anatta, not self, and dukkha, which we might translate quickly as suffering, more accurately but more wordly as unsatisfactoriness. You know, Peter Harvey in his Introduction to Buddhism, the main, this very big seller, makes big play of the fact that unsatisfactoriness is a much better way of rendering what Buddhists actually mean, but it's really ugly. Some older translations you might find free on the internet, you call it sorrow. But again, there are problems with calling that. Some also call it stress. Right. In some translations you might find, again, free on the internet. In the 19th century, it translated as sin, in some very biblical-sounding translations.
Quite extraordinary.
They were calling, it sounds like there were passages from King James. They're full of that kind of language, but they translated that. But before we come to dukkha, we'll perhaps start with anicca, which is impermanence, and says everything is impermanent. And things which are impermanent are the physical things around us, but also every aspect of ourselves. So only in meditation might we come to reflect on the impermanence of things. The mountains, even the things that seem permanent, will get washed away over time. Things will break, things will, and putting our predicating our happiness on things is seen as foolish, because they don't last, they're temporary. But also people are seen as temporary. And not just people in a general sense, but every aspect of a person is seen as impermanent. So impermanence is something that marks out every feature of existence. And actually a lot of other Buddhist ideas wouldn't make sense without the teaching on impermanence. One of the problems of Buddhism is how interlinked all the teachings are. It's hard to know where to start as a teacher of Buddhism, because they're all over the place and they won't get this theory without this one. But impermanence is quite a good place to start, because you need to assume that, or take that as a starting point for the others to kind of make some sense. So anicca, everything's impermanent, everything is in a, to put it another way, in a state of flux. And everything is in a state of both coming into being and passing away from being. And there are other Buddhist teachings about conditioned arising or dependent origination, which rely on that. The idea that things are permanently coming into being and going away. And in fact, the last words of the Buddha are sometimes rendered more poetically as being about the fact that everything that's of a nature to come into being is also of a nature to pass away from being. So everything that comes to exist will pass away. That leads us really to the next mark of existence, which is anatta, or not self. This is probably the most persistent and controversial. It's the one that people have the most problem with, and it's the one that scholars have most disagreement about.
Okay.
But anatta comes from the idea of atta, which in Pali, the Buddhist language, is similar to as equivalent of Atman in Sanskrit.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. In the Hindu religion tends to, very broad church, very hard to say anything with definition that isn't got some qualification in Hinduism. But Hindu generally, in many forms of Hinduism, believe that Atman, and certainly in the old Upanishadic version of Hinduism, believed that the Atman was the inner self, the bit of you that would be reborn, the bit of you that was permanent and would keep going, and the bit of you also that was divine. And so to say anatta, not self, is to say you don't have an atta or an atman. And so to see how it draws or follows from or is connected with impermanence, the Anarcha teaching, you will do meditation, and to use the phrase used in some books on the subject, it says not so much that Buddhism denies there is a self, but says go and look for it and you will discover that no self can be found.
Right.
So it's seen as an experiential teaching as much as an academic one. So if you sit and you meditate and you consider your body, and each part of it is temporary and it's coming into being, will one day pass from being, that's not a problem, not that difficult to kind of get. But if you look at your mental states, you'll also come to the view that all the aspects of you have your personality, of your consciousness, of your deeper subconscious characteristics and values and things, are all temporary. There's a time when they didn't exist, and in the future there'll be a time when they don't exist. So Buddhism says that every aspect of a person is subject to change and coming into and away from being. So everything about a person is as in flux as the world around us, as a river going past us. There is continuity over time, provided by both your physical continuity and by some mental continuity. But over time, everything is subject to change. And that's quite a radical teaching. It's quite distinctive, and it can take quite a few thinks about it, I guess, for students to take on board. There are questions we might not look at now, but are raised by students about what is reborn.
Yes.
What is it?
Yes.
And because of the Hindu view, it's a thing.
Yes.
Like in the Christian view, the soul would go on to a future.
Yes, I was going to ask you about how does this compare with kind of Greek concepts of the immortality of the soul and so on. And perhaps we'll do that in another session. But
yeah, but it does deny it in a way, because it says it isn't about what carries on. And in fact, you might say they're not what questions.
Okay. Yeah.
They're how questions. So you might say that the Buddhist view of persons is much more a process view of persons rather than an ontological view of persons. What they made, what things are there. It's not a metaphysical being that carries on. It's a process of change. Just as you now are very different from the you when you were 7, and everything about you has changed. But there's a continuity, so there is a continuity between lives, but not a thing passed on.
Right.
So just as you, the person now, was caused by the 7-year-old through a series of intermediary states, so the next person or being to be born will be caused by this being. So there's a cause of the continuity, but not a thing.
Right.
So it's not a what carries on, but how do things carry on.
That's about process.
Absolutely. And people often say Buddhism takes a process view of persons. The last of these 3 marks is translated in terms of its very raw translation. Dukkha is translated as suffering, and that works for some settings, but not others. And I think actually we need to take coming out the other two first to make sense of what Buddhists really seem to mean by it. And they seem to say the world as we experience it is unsatisfactory because of the first 2 marks, partly. Because we try and find happiness and everything moves, the sand shifts below our feet. And there is, where can we look for happiness? We might look in things, again, new cars and new things, but they all get tired and broken, but they're impermanent. They're not a lasting source of happiness. We might, in other religions, look to God. A lot of religions say, replace temporary things with reliance on the one permanent thing. But in Buddhism, there isn't a one permanent thing. Even the gods seem, like us, finite, immortal, on a different scale, but still impermanent, not the answer.
And in flux.
In flux, certainly, and ultimately irrelevant. They might be very long-lived and very powerful compared to us, but not all-powerful, not eternal. So there's nowhere to, as it were, nail our colours. There's nowhere to kind of find lasting happiness. everything we look for is unpleasant. And as Buddhism says, to be born is suffering. To not get what you want is suffering. To live is suffering. To die is suffering. To get old, to get ill, to get sick is suffering. There are those who think, God, this is pessimistic. The way I've described it doesn't sound particularly cheerful. But another way of viewing it is say, well, if you stop being attached to things, people, feelings, connections with these things, and expecting them to bring you happiness, and then being disappointed, you expect to get what you want, and then you don't, and you're unhappy. Or you do get what you want, and you find out you didn't want it after all. If you stop looking for happiness like that, you will cut off the roots of unhappiness. So we're unhappy, or the world is dukkha, the world is unsatisfactory, because we look for permanent happiness in things that aren't permanent.
Right.
We look in the wrong kind of places. So Buddhism says the world, which is hence my initial comments, the world as we experience it is unpleasant. And we can't avoid some forms of physical pain.
Sure.
We get older, we get cronkier, the body hurts, and then there will be the vicissitudes of life. People will hit us, throw things at us, and things will hurt like that. We'll fall off our bikes, have various unpleasantnesses. And even if we remove those, as we know from very rich people, they're still not happy, which makes us feel a bit better. In that people even sat in their mansions amongst kind of great happiness with their beautiful partner and their pool and their kind of cocktail, still kind of sigh. Still, we'll still listen to a blues record and find in it the same kind of suffering in the voice of the person that they're feeling, and thinking, is something more? Surely this isn't. I've looked for happiness in this. I've got it, but I'm still not happy. Yeah. So there's not only is there life's unpleasantnesses and knocks and unpleasant things will happen to us, but even when they don't, even when we get what we want, we still have a more subtle sense of what we might call dis-ease,
right,
and happiness. Yes. And Buddhism says that sense of dukkha underlies the other senses. That even when we do get what we want, there's something else there that is a problem for us. But luckily, to make it less of a pessimistic religion, Buddhism says we can do something about it. And I'm not going to talk about that now.
We'll talk about that another time.
But you can do something about it. So it's not all, despite what I've said for the last few minutes, doom and gloom.
Thank you.
Pleasure.